I know has nothing to do with reading the Communist Manifesto, but I ordered coffee last night because I'm out at my place, and it was supposed to be here at like 10:30 this morning, and it's 3 and it still isn't here. So like I tried to, I finally like lost my patience, and I tried to go buy some at the store downstairs, and my card somehow suspended itself, so I had to like come back up and find my other card, and then I realized like I could unsuspend my card from my app, and so that's why I'm late. And I still haven't had my coffee, but I'm gonna go to Marxist.org right now, and we're going to begin reading the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto. And I do apologize for being late. I needed my coffee if I'm going to do like a 45-minute stream of reading. So I'm just navigating my way over yonder to this. So the first chapter we read was Bourgeois and Proletarians. Now, Bourgeois are the bosses, Proletarians are the workers. Pretty simple. And now we're doing Proletarians and Communists, chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. So without further ado, one second, wait. I love iced coffee too. Okay, Proletarians and Communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. You know what? I think I forgot to hand sanitize before I fucking got back. I'm sorry. Communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole, right? They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own, by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from other working class parties by this only: in the national struggle of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front of common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of the development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So communists will always represent the interests of the working class as a whole. That is, numero fucking uno. All right, so continuing. Communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically and most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formations of the proletariat into a class, overthrow the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So I'm going to read that again because I kind of tripped over it, I feel. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat, the working class, into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So getting communists' number one objective is obtaining political power for the working class. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on the ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms, actual relations springing from existing class struggle, from a historical movement going under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. So that again, the abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have been continually subject to historical changes, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property in general, but the abolition of the bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of many by the few. Now, again, as in last stream, if you would like to ask me questions, it's best if you tag me on Twitter, but I will keep my phone up so you can message me on Facebook as well. I'll do my best to answer any questions. I'm not an expert. I am learning as I read to you. So, although I do know quite a bit of this, but not all of it. Okay, continuing. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property in general, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But the modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of many by the few. In this sense, the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists had been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as a fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan, of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. That's important. I love that. I love that. All right. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Exclamation point in the actual text. Do you mean the property of a petty artisan and of the small peasant and a form of property that has preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that at all. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. Oh man, what a wonderful fucking line. Wow. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? Continuing. What does wage labor create? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., the kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon conditions of getting a new supply of wage labor from fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is, therefore, not only personal, it is social power. It is a social power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e., the quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the labor in bare existence as the laborer. So minimum wage labor is only, purposeful to keep you poor, okay? What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality. Excuse me. While the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called the bourgeois. Abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so, the abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. So I'm going to read that sentence again because I paused. And the abolition of this state of things is called the bourgeois. Abolition of individuality and of freedom, and rightly so, the abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with unfettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with by 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to non-existence in the hands of the 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with the intending to do away with property. Precisely so, this is just what we intend. For the moment when the laborer can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by any individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of the property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Yeah. So that's a complicated line right there, right? And I'm only pausing because I guess, labor aristocracy that exists in the United States, like the middle class in the United States only exists in the way it does because we take resources from other countries through imperialism, right? So when Marx and Engels right here are speaking about the middle class, they're not referencing like the same kind of middle class that exists today. Okay, we're not trying to take the house of somebody who makes like $60,000 a year and has like 3 children and a wife that makes like the same amount, right? We're not. That's not the goal, as was stated above. But I felt I needed to clarify that due to the use of the term middle class. So let's find where I was. Oh goodness, I lost my place. All right. Well, we'll go back just a teensy bit. From the moment the labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeoisie, than the middle-class owner of the property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease. The universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, the bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. And tautology is a big old word, and I've heard it before and I've used it before, but I want to give you a proper definition. So tautology is defined, it's a noun, as the saying of the same thing twice in different words, generally considered to be the fault of style. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can be no longer any wage labor where there is no longer any capital. Okay, so it's just saying that is, you know, a sort of almost redundancy, like it's a self-repeating process, I guess, if I understand that correctly. All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have, in the same way, been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products, just as, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself. So the disappearance of class culture is, to him, identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine, right? So that culture, the loss of which the bourgeois laments, is, for everyone else, the proletariat, a mere training to act as a machine. So the bourgeois culture that exists for rich people, the rich people's culture, for us, for the working people, that same culture is just being, basically an appendage of a machine, right? Your labor. Okay, so continuing. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois nations of freedom, culture, law, etc. Okay, that's a mistranslation. I don't know. I think that's etc. So I'm going to start that sentence over. And again, if you want to read on with me, I'm on Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto on Marxist.org. So going back a little, but don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property, the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence for your class. So I'm going to Google jurisprudence because that's a big old word again, and I'm not sure I know what that means. I think it has something to do with like law and jurisdiction, but... So jurisprudence is a theory or philosophy of law. So we're going to go back and read that briefly so people actually understand if you're just listening for the first time. But do not wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of conditions of your bourgeois production and the bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all, and a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. This selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, the misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you, what you see clearly is in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up of this infamous proposal of communists. Now, if you remember from chapter 1, Marx was talking about how the family has essentially been reduced to, I guess, in essence, monetary relations, which is a shame. Kind of takes the soul out of your family, right? I mean, how many marriages end in divorce? I know I'm going off a little here. How many marriages ended in divorce because of financial reasons? How many people get married because of financial reasons? On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. Now, he's not referring to like prostitutes, right? I'm gonna Google this. What did Marx mean by prostitution? It's a problem that I can't define this. Yeah, if you know what Marx meant by prostitution, I have a ton of messages. Wow. Oh, Anya. Okay, continuing. Hold on a second. Okay, that made me smile. I just got a message. The bourgeois family. Okay, where were we? We're talking about public prostitution, but again, I don't think he means like actual prostitution. I'm pretty sure he's talking about just like the selling of labor in general. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you say we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education, is it not also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct and indirect, of society, by means of school, etc.? The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education, but they do seek to alter the character of that intervention and to recuse education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap. The bourgeois claptrap. I don't know why that makes me laugh. The bourgeois claptrap about family and education. I'm sorry. That's a funny way to phrase it. The bourgeois claptrap of the family and education, and I'm sorry. I'm losing it. All right. About the hollowed co-relations of parent and child becomes all of the more disgusting, the more by action of modern industry, all the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeois in chorus. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeois chorus. Oh, God forbid a community of women. How fucking horrible. Jesus Christ. Anyways, the bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears the instruments of production are to be exploited in common and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all of the will likewise fall to the women. So, I'm going to repeat that. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common and, naturally, can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the commodity of women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives, daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. It's true. These fucking swingers, man. Am I right? No, I'm kidding. Bourgeois marriage is, in reality, a system of wives in common, and thus, at most, what communists might possibly reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e. of prostitution, both public and private. So that's a lot of, old words put in old form, but it's basically saying that like women can't be liberated without the abolition of bourgeois private property. All right, so continuing, the communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. So, repeating, the supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to faster vanish. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. That's a big one right there. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, i.e. the working class, right? Okay? In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will be also put to an end, and the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonisms between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. Imagine that. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, conceptions in one word, man's consciousness changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that the intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. I'm going to repeat that one. What else does the history of ideas prove than the intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of the ideas of When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. Oh man, oh man, I forget which philosopher said this. But there was a philosopher that basically said that all ideas in the past are unoriginal because they're inherently based upon previous ideas. So, anyways, not particularly relevant, but I believe that is sort of what Marx is alluding to right there. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to the rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with then the revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, quote, undoubtedly, end quote, it will be said, quote, religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change, end quote. Quote, there are, besides, eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion, all morality, instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences. Now, this isn't saying that a lot of people misinterpret what that says to say that like Marx and communists are like anti-religion. That could not be further from the truth. There is a deep history of religion in socialist and communist sort of happenings throughout history in the world. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assumed different forms at different epochs. So I guess what the previous bit is referencing in terms of religion is that religion will actually improve itself and be more free and lead to, I guess you could say, a closeness to God without interference from the bourgeoisie, your bosses, the rich. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common at all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all multiplicity and variety it displays, moves with certain common forms or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonism. So what I was saying about religion being improved and societal conception of religion and God being improved with the removal of bourgeois property was correct. So I will repeat that. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture within traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. What we have seen above, that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, because communism is what actual democracy fucking looks like. For those of you who think that we live in our democracy now, we live in the exact opposite of a democracy. If we had a democracy, the working class would own the means of production, the factories, shops, etc. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. Of the proletariat organizes the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible, right? So this means that basically the working class are gonna fucking rise up, they're gonna take all the rich people's shit, they're gonna organize themselves and make life better for everyone as a result. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following will be generally applicable. Now, Marx goes on to list a list of 10 things. So I'm going to do this slowly. 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive and graduated income tax. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of property of all emigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Now, we're on number 6. I want to pause and remind you that at this point, the working class is the ruling class of a country, right? So centralizing it in the hands of a state just means that like the workers have organized and now have control of communication. Continuing with number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of the wastelands, and the improvement of soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. So I'm going to repeat number 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. Oh my goodness, this is literally exactly what China is doing. I have no idea how people get in their minds that that China is not communist. Like, get the fuck out of here. You have no idea what you're talking about. Read a book. All right, continuing. Free education for all children in public schools. Huh? That sounds nice. Abolition of a children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. So those are the 10 things that Marx lists as, these are sort of things that will happen in countries after they have their, their working class revolution. So, continuing. Oh, wow, we're almost done. When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of a whole nation, public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away the force of old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class, right? In place of an old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. That's chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. That was fucking fantastic. That may have been my favorite chapter. That I like that one more than the first one, just because it's very, we're saber rattling or whatever. I don't know if that's the right term. But this has been a 39-minute stream, and I don't know how long the third chapter is, but we might continue going because I'm jacked up on caffeine right now. It's not so bad. Okay, yeah. So This is going to be a fun chapter. I feel like I should read this right now. Okay. Chapter 3, Socialist and Communist Literature. Reactionary Socialism. A. Feudal socialism. Owing to their historical position, it becomes a vocation of the aristocracies of France and England to write pamphlets against modern bourgeois society. In the French Revolution of July 1830 and in the English Reform agitation, these aristocracies again succumb to the hateful upstart. Thenceforth, a serious political struggle was altogether out of the question. A literary battle alone remained possible, but even in the domain of literature, the old cries of the Restoration period had become impossible. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy was obliged to lose sight, apparently, of its own interests and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeois in the interests of the exploited working class alone. Thus, the aristocracy took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new masters and whispering in his ear sinister prophecies of coming catastrophe. In this way arose feudal socialism, half lamentation, half lampoon, half an echo of the past, half a menace of the future, at times by its own bitter, witty, incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect, through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. The aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, have waved the proletarian alms bag in front of the banner, for the people, so often as it joined them, saw on their own hindquarters the old feudal coat of arms, and deserted with loud and irreverent laughter. One section of the French legitimists and Young England exhibited this spectacle. I have no idea what the hell that means, and I'm sorry for that. There's hyperlinks here, but I feel like I'm going to get distracted if I click on them, but I'm going to do it anyways. Okay. Oh, Glossary of Organization. So legitimists are French adherents to the legitimate Bourbon dynasty overthrown in 1830, which had represented the interests of the big landed nobility in their struggle against the reigning Orleans dynasty 1830 to 48. A section of the legitimists projected themselves as defenders of the working people against exploitation by the rising industrial bourgeoisie. And Young England is a group of British men belonging to the Tory party, formed the group in the early 1840s. Unsatisfied with the landed aristocracy and the growing strength of the bourgeoisie, the group made appeals to the working class to fight the bourgeoisie in order to restore a pre-capitalist government. So he's basically saying these two sort of like fake socialists were fake. Yeah, they sucked. Fuck those guys. Anyways, in pointing out that their mode of production was different to that of the bourgeoisie, the feudalists forget that they exploited under circumstances and conditions that were quite different and that are now antiquated, in showing that under the rule, the modern proletariat never existed. They forgot the modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring of their own form of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeois amounts to this, that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is destined to cut up, root, and branch the old order of society. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie is what they upbraid. I don't know what upbraid means. I think it means just like root up. I don't know. Upbraid. Let's see. Find fault with. Okay. I believe that's what it means in this context. So what they upbraid with the bourgeois society, what they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat, right? In political practice, therefore, they join in all coercive measures against the working class and in ordinary life, despite their high flatoon phases. The fuck does that high Folotune? High folotune. What does folotune mean? Follotin. High follotin. Oh, it's one word. Okay. High follotin is an adjective, an informal adjective, especially of speech, writing, or ideas, pompous or pretentious. Okay, cool. So now going back, if I can find the spot. Okay. In political practice, therefore, they join in coercive measures. Wait, did I lose? Am I in the wrong spot? Hold on. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their Wait, going back one more. In pointing out that their mode of exploitation was different to that of the bourgeoisie, the feudalists forget that they exploited under circumstances and conditions that were quite different and that are now antiquated. In showing that under their rule, the modern proletariat never existed, they forget that the modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring of their own form of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism, that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie amounts to this, that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is destined to cut up and root and branch the old order of society. When they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. In political practice, therefore, they join in all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their high fall-attuned phrases, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry and to barter truth, love, and honor for traffic in wool, beetroot sugar, and potato spirits. So basically he's saying that these like fake communists, these like people who like guise their capitalist fascism in revolutionary rhetoric are really just trying to make money off of you and buy alcohol. Well, that too. But as the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so has clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrats. Oh, yeah. So again, rich people taint your religion. B, petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pined and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses is a word we're going to Google because we didn't do that the first time during the first chapter, and it was a mistake. Burgess, an inhabitant of a town or boroughs with full rights of citizenship. That's the British historical meaning. But, I mean, it roughly means the same things in other definitions as well. So, okay. So, yeah. All right. So, burgess is an inhabitant of a town or borough with full rights to citizenship. So these are, I guess, privileged town people who are maybe wealthy. I don't know. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pined and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. Hold on. Oh God, I'm getting messages. Oh, all right, now my coffee arrives. Someone just sent me a TikTok. I'll read it after if you're watching. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition, and as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half of the population, it was natural that the writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use in their criticism of the bourgeois regime the standard of the peasant and the petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes should take up the cudgels for the working class. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France, but also in England. I guess Sismondi was some sort of political theorist at some point. Sounds like he sucked. Fuck that guy. I don't know. Just saying. This school of socialism dissected with the great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. Oh, yeah. This school of socialism dissected with great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crises. It pointed out that the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and the peasant, the misery of the proletariat and the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the dissolution of old moral bonds, and the family relations of the old nationalities. Oh, we're making some progress here, team. All right. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them old property relations and the old society, or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange within the framework of old property relations that have been and were bound to be exploded by those means. In either case, it is reactionary and utopian. Its last words are corporate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relations in agriculture. Ugh. Ultimately, when the stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. I think he means blues like we use it in the modern sense. Yeah, that would make sense, right? What did Marx mean by the blues? The first thing that comes up is on blues, Marx and Elvis. Okay, so I think that maybe that is actually what he means. Okay, German or true socialism. The socialist and communist literature of France, a literature that originated under the pressure of the bourgeoisie in power, and that was the expressions of the struggle against this power, was introduced into Germany at the time when the bourgeoisie in that country had just begun its contest with feudal absolutism. Now, this was written far before World War II, so Germany was not in sort of the same circumstances that it was before. I'm getting a phone call. This is probably them letting me know my package is here. Hello? Yeah. Hello, a package is waiting for you. Okay, thank you. All right. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits, men of letters, eagerly seized on this beaux esprits parentheses, men of letters, so you understand what beaux esprits means. Men of letters, right? People who write. So German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits, eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. So this philosophy immigrated from France to Germany. Uh, okay, without like a immigration of social conditions, right? So these ideas were separated from the social conditions which created them in France when they arrived in Germany. So, in contact with German social conditions, this French literature lost all of its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than the demands of practical reason. In general, the quote, practical reason. In general, the utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified in their eyes the laws of the pure will, of will as it was bound to be, of true will generally. The work of German literati, I guess that's sort of like literati is being used as like sort of maybe elite writers, right? Elite people who use literature. So the work of the German literati considered solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather in annexing the French ideas without distorting their own philosophic point of view. Now, I want to go back and say that maybe when he says literati, he's not referring to like elite people who use literature necessarily, but sort of thought leaders who express their thoughts in literature. And thought leaders are not necessarily elites. That's an important distinction. And I want to make sure I'm just not making shit up, so I'm gonna Google that. Yeah, I guess that my definition was somewhat correct. I mean, there's a whole fucking, there's a lot on that word, but that is, I guess you could say, yeah. So they're like petty bourgeois writers, I guess, right? People who are like servants of the ruling class, but like profit somewhat from it and are beholden to their power. Um, okay. The work of the German literati consisted solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather in annexing the French ideas without distorting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which foreign language is appropriated, namely by translation. That is interesting. You know, Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong. Apparently, Mao Zedong, that translation, right, versus Zedong versus Zedong. Zedong was apparently like the colonial British translation, so there's a little bit of racism ingrained in there. Is at least that's what I've been told. So, just as a for example, right? This annexation took place in the same way in which foreign language is appropriated, namely by translation. So yeah, I guess Marx is referencing the bigotry of, sort of the petty bourgeois literature writers. It is well known how the monks wrote silly lives of Catholic saints over the manuscripts on which the classical works of ancient heathendom had been written. The German literati reversed this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath their French criticisms of the economic functions of money, they wrote alienation of humanity, and beneath the French criticisms of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. Yeah, so he's basically just saying, like, fuck these guys, they distort shit. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of the French historical criticisms they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundations of socialism, and so on. So I think he's actually specifically attacking certain members of the literati here. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated. This man is savage. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with another, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. Fucking Hegelians is what he's saying. These people have no attachment to the material reality. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and extolled its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank. What is mountebank? I've never even heard that word. I have to Google that and then reread this sentence. Mountebank means a person who deceives others, especially in order to roads flowing around this country. So let me find where it was. Oh God. I just lost my whole spot. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but requirements of truth, not in the interest of the proletariat, but the interest of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and extolled its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank fashion, meanwhile gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The fight of the Germans, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement, became more earnest. Fucking liberals, am I right? Ugh, hate those people. By this, the long-wished-for opportunity was offered to true socialism of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of press, bourgeois legislation, bourgeois liberty, and bourgeois equality, and of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. By this bourgeois movement, German socialism forgot in the nick of time that the French criticism, whose silly echo it was, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society with its corresponding economic conditions of existence and the political constitution adapted thereto, the very things those attainment was the object of the pending struggle in Germany. To the absolute governments with their following parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcoming scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. So I think he's basically explaining how French proletarians got duped by elites. It was a sweet, oh God, reminds me of democratic socialism. Thinking emoji. Anyways, where are we? To the absolute governments with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. I shouldn't say democratic socialism, I should say social democrats. To the absolute governments with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of flogging and bullets with which the same governments just at that time dosed the German working class risings. While this, quote, true socialism thus served the government as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it at the same time directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeois class, a relic of the 16th century, and since then constantly cropping up again under various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction. On the one hand, from the concentration of capital, on the other, from the rise of the revolutionary proletariat. True socialism appeared to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The robe of speculative cobwebs embroidered with the flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of silky sentiment. This transcendental robe in which the German socialists wrap their sorry, quote, eternal truths, all skin and bone, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods amongst such a public. Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to read that one again because it's a hell of a line. The robe of speculative cobwebs, embroidered with flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of silky sentiment, this transcendental robe in which German socialists wrapped their sorry eternal truths, all skin and bone, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods amongst such a public. And on its part, German socialism recognized more and more its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty Philistine to be the typical man. To every villainous meanness of the model man. Villainous meanness. I don't know what the fuck that villainous. What does this mean? All right, we're gonna Google that, team. We're gonna Google it. Villainous. Villainous. Relating to constituting or guilty of wicked or criminal behavior. Okay. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation. And you know what? We have to Google Philistine too, because I'm willing to bet that a lot of people might not know what that means. So Philistine, a person who is hostile or indifferent to culture and the arts, or who has no understanding of them. I like that word. I'm gonna use that. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, the German petty Philistine to be the typical man, to every villainous meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher, socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the extreme length of directly opposing the brutal, destructive tendency of communism. Quote, brutal, destructive tendency of communism, and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles, with very few exceptions. All the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, in 1847, circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and inveterating literature. And enervating. We have to Google that too, team. Enervating. What does this mean? Causing one to feel drained of energy or vitality. Kind of like coming down from drinking a ton of coffee, huh? So, we're going to start over on that last paragraph, because now we have all these words defined. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty Philistine to be the typical man, to every villainous meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the extreme length of directly opposing the, quote, brutal, destructive tendency of communism, and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles, with very few exceptions. All the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, in 1847, circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature. Woo! All right, wow, okay. Yeah, we're about halfway done with chapter 3, and I am out of steam, team. Well, maybe I'm not. Okay, going on. Conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of this bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of the bourgeois society. Oh my God. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of the bourgeois society. Does that remind you of maybe, I don't know, fucking Bill Gates? Fuck that guy. To this section of belong to this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. We might cite Proudhon's Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this form. Proudhon. Okay, sorry. This socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern socialism. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeois without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally convinces the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In requiring the proletariat to carry out such a system, thereby to march straightway into the new social Jerusalem, into the social New Jerusalem, but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. I'm reminded of like false hope and pacifism when I read that paragraph. A second and more practical but less systematic form of socialism sought to depreciate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence in economic relations could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism, however, by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected only by a revolution, but administrative reforms based on the continued existence of these relations, reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relations between capital and labor, but at the best lessen the cost and simplify administrative work of bourgeois government. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when, and only when, it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. So that's really just a condemnation of reform in general, I believe. We do not here refer to the literature which in every great modern revolution has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of Babouf, and others. Okay, there's a hyperlink on Babouf. Babouf, French political agitator, plotted unsuccessfully to destroy the Directory in revolutionary France and establish a communistic system. Okay, that's Babouf. Babouf is a person. We do not here refer to the was a person. We do not here refer to the literature which in every great modern revolution has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of Babouf and others. So I think he's actually Yeah, okay. Anyways, I'm not going to try to interpret that because I'm not sure I don't want to mislead anyone. So, we do not here refer to that literature which, in every great modern revolution, has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of Babeuf and others. So I think he likes Babeuf, but I'm not sure. It sounds like he likes Babeuf. The first direct attempts, I like saying Babeuf. That's a fun word to say. Babeuf, Babeuf. All right, anyways. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends made in times of universal excitement when feudal society was being overthrown necessarily failed, owing to the then undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character. It inoculated universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest form. That's a big one. That's a big one. All right, we're going to read that one again. But what I think he's basically saying is that because like the social conditions of and like the material conditions of industrial production had not advanced along with the ideals of the proletariat, that these ideals inherently had sort of capitalistic and fascistic undertones that were unreckoned with, I guess I could say. So we're going to read that one again. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends, made in times of universal excitement when feudal society was being overthrown, necessarily failed, owing to the then underdeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character. It inculcated universal asceticism. It inculcated universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest forms. So I don't know what inculcated means, and I do believe asceticism is like a form of practicing pain for religion. Asceticism, severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgence, typically for religious reasons. And inculcated, let's see what inculcated means. Inculcate, instill an attitude, idea, or habit by persistent instruction. Oh, like Goebbels. Okay. So it inculcated universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest form. The socialist and communist systems, properly so called those of the Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, and not Führer, Fourier. Remember, this was written far before Hitler came into power. So the socialist and communist systems, properly so called those of Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, sprang into existence in the early undeveloped period described above of the struggle between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. So let's see what Saint Simon, Fourier, and Owen are. Oh, God. Fourier, Francois Charles, 1772 to 1837. He was a French utopian socialist. Okay. And Saint Simon was Saint Simon Comte. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Saint Simon, 1760 to 1825, was also a French utopian, a socialist. And Owen, my guess, was also a French utopian socialist. Oh, no, he was a Welsh industrialist and socialist reformer. He formed a model industry community at New Lanark, Scotland, and pioneered cooperative societies. Okay, cool. And he lived from 1771 to 1851. Wow. Wow, he lived a long time. As an old man for back then. Okay, so we're going to read that one again. The socialist and communist systems, properly so called, those of Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, spring into existence in the early undeveloped period described above of the struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie. The founders of these systems see, indeed, the class antagonisms as well as the action of decomposing elements of the prevailing form of society, but the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers to them the spectacle of a class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement. We're making a lot of progress. We're almost done with chapter 3. Since the development of class antagonisms keeps even pace with the development of industry, the economic situation as they find it does not yet offer to them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They, therefore, search after a new social science, after new social laws that are to create these conditions. Historical action is to yield to their personal inventive action. Historically created conditions of emancipation to fantastic ones, and the gradual, spontaneous class organization of the proletariat to an organization of society, especially contrived by these inventors. Future history resolves itself in their eyes into the propaganda and the practical carrying out of their social plans. In the formation of their plans, they are conscious of caring chiefly for the interests of the working class as being the most suffering class. Only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them. The undeveloped state of the class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve conditions of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large, without the distinction of class, nay, by preference, to the ruling class. For how can people, when once they understand their system, fail to see it in the best possible plan of the best possible state of society? Hence, they reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means, necessarily doomed to failure, and by the force of example, they pave the way for a new social gospel. So he's basically saying that utopian socialists are doomed to failure. Because they don't actually they're like, oh, everyone's equal except everyone's equal, as opposed to we need to raise up the working class and take down the ruling class, right? Those are two opposing ideas. So continuing. Such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, conversion of the functions of the state into a more superintendence of production. All of these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were, at the time, only just cropping up, and which, in these publications, are recognized in the earliest indistinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. The significance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an inverse relation to the historical development. In proportion as the modern class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing, apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it, lose all practical value and all theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of these systems were in many aspects revolutionary, their disciples have in every case formed mere reactionary sects. sects. They hold fast by the original views of their masters in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They therefore endeavor, and that consistently, to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile class antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realizations of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteers. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteers, of establishing home colonies, or setting up little Icaria, duodecimo editions of the New Jerusalem. And to realize all of these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. By degrees, they sink into category of the reactionary or conservative socialists depicted above, differing from these only by a more systemic pedantry and by their fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effects of their social science. They therefore violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel. The ONTs in England and the forestries in France, respectively, oppose Chartists and Reformistes. That's chapter 3, folks. At the beginning, I had said that he wasn't necessarily dissing on these utopian socialists, but he actually was. So I apologize for that. And, we read 2 chapters today. We'll do chapter 4 tomorrow. And I think that's basically, we'll finish the Communist Manifesto tomorrow at 3 p.m. PST, 6 p.m. EST, with chapter 4, which is positions of the communists in relations to the various existing opposition parties. After that, as I'm still doing some work on trying to sort of synthesize my views on capitalism and the opioid epidemic, we will probably read the first chapter of Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. Yasha was kind enough to give me permission to read. I don't know if I legally needed permission, but I may have, and I also wanted his permission. So we are going to read the first chapter of Surveillance Valley after we finish the Communist Manifesto. And if you don't know what Surveillance Valley is, it's this. And Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet by Yasha Levine. And one of the reviews on it says it's by Maximilian Blumenthal. In this fast-paced myth-busting expose, Yasha Levine documents how a collection of spooks, cybernetic fanatics, and libertarian oligarchs have exploited the internet to promote regime change abroad and establish a totalistic spying network at home. Surveillance Valley is an unprecedented journalistic achievement, revealing the untold history of anti-democratic regimes that rules over our lives from behind a glossy LED screen. That sounds fucking riveting. It is. And the first chapter is absolutely fantastic. So we'll get to that after we finish the Communist Manifesto tomorrow. And maybe that will be a Saturday stream or possibly a Monday stream. We will see. Anyways, I really hope everyone enjoyed this. Power to the people.